Baroness Louise Casey released her long-awaited national audit, which was commissioned back in January. Many MPs, when the government tried to quash the promised 5 local inquiries, raised the fact that it was overdue. And then we heard from the Sun newspaper reporting that the government had it in their hands for a week and were petrified of putting it out because they thought it might spike civil unrest. If anyone who's been following Dominic Cummings and David Betts' warnings of ethnic civil war erupting across particularly the Red Wall areas that we saw rioting and peacefully protesting in the aftermath of the Southport massacre last summer, you'll know this is a very legitimate concern, and the state has reacted to this concern by trying to glue shut the lid on the sputtering pot of ethno-cultural tensions, but only for the white working classes, whom they keep demonizing as far-right, while affording special protections and victim status to protected characteristic imported minority groups. And one of these imported minority groups is, of course, Britain's Pakistani Muslim enclaves. And Baroness Louise Casey, she wrote the report in 2015 into Rotherham, and at the time, and I have a quote here, people who spoke to her, whistleblowers and witnesses, said you couldn't bring up race issues in meetings or you would be branded a racist, and if we mentioned Asian taxi drivers, we were told we were racist and that young people were seen as prostitutes. And lots of people concerned who came to her had to euphemize the fact that Pakistanis, first and second generation, were engaged in widespread child sexual exploitation and grooming networks. And as we've seen from lots of the transcripts coming out from the trials, like the one that Max Tempers famously posted of the Oxford 2013 grooming gang trial, which caught the attention of Elon Musk and reignited the entire scandal back in January on X, these were not just child sexual exploitation groups, these were ritualistic torture groups. I mean, 7 men were just charged in Rotherham for keeping a group of girls as sex slaves. There were girls who had their tongues nailed to tables when they threatened to tell, who were threatened with guns, who had the letter M for Muhammad branded into their flesh. This is the worst kind of abuse you can imagine, and the state conspired for decades to cover it up. And Casey has been at the heart of this for, again, at least a decade, trying to expose this cover-up. And so it's commendable that she's done this, and she's come out and shattered a lot of the taboos about the grooming gangs with her report. She has a whole section of the report just titled Denial, and one of the items for repudiation that she's targeted is the 2020 Home Office report that said that, at least it got its headlines in The Guardian, that the majority of perpetrators were white males. This is the kind of lie that Tessa Munt, the Liberal Democrat MP, was repeating in Parliament recently during a grooming gang debate.
May I say my blood is boiling listening to this stuff coming from the Conservative benches. If they had read the ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, they would recognise that there are hundreds of thousands of people alive today, people just like me, white girls who suffered at the hands of white men, and they've just got clean away with it because nothing was done.
This was the kind of lie that Dr. Ella Cockbain wrote in The Guardian about, triumphantly saying that white men are the real problem, that you don't have anything to see here about the grooming gangs, even though Ella Cockbain's own sampling of sex offenders found that 80% of them were Pakistani, and she just said, well, we hesitate to draw conclusions from this. Louise Casey said that a lot of the data that they were basing this on was erroneous, incomplete, that lots of local authorities, the Crown Prosecution Service, His Majesty's court system, the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice didn't hold any data on the ethnicity of suspects and victims, and she had to go to all of the local police districts, as we did at Courage Media for West Yorkshire police data, in order to report on this stuff. And what she found was a vast overrepresentation of Pakistani males among the child sexual exploitation perpetrators in these areas. So she found that 2/3 of all of the suspects had no ethnicity recorded. So 2/3 of the suspects in these cases did not have their ethnicity recorded.
Mr. Speaker, I warned in January that the data collection we had inherited from the previous government on ethnicity was completely inadequate. It was only collected on 37% of suspects. Baroness Casey's audit confirms that ethnicity data is not recorded for 2/3 of grooming gang perpetrators And she says it is not good enough to support any statements about the ethnicity of group-based child sexual exploitation offenders at the national level. I agree with that conclusion. And frankly, it is ridiculous and helps no one that this basic information is not collected, especially when there have been warnings and recommendations stretching back 13 years about the woefully inadequate data on perpetrators, which prevents patterns of crime being understood and tackled. The immediate changes I announced in January to police recording practices are starting to improve the data, but we will need to go much further. Baroness Casey's audit examined local-level data in 3 police force areas, Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire and South Yorkshire, where high-profile cases involving Pakistani heritage men have long been investigated and reported, and there they found the suspects of group-based child sexual offences were disproportionately likely to be Asian men. She also found indications of disproportionality in serious case reviews. And while much more robust national data is needed, we cannot and must not shy away from these findings because, as Baroness Casey says, ignoring the issues, not examining and exposing them to the light, allows the criminality and depravity of a minority of men to be used to marginalise whole communities. The vast majority of people in our British, Asian and Pakistani heritage communities continue to be appalled by these terrible crimes and agree that the criminal minority of sick predators and perpetrators in every community must be dealt with robustly by the criminal law. Baroness Casey's review also identifies prosecutions and investigations into perpetrators who are white, British, European, African or Middle Eastern, just as Alexis Jay's inquiry concluded that all ethnicities and communities were involved in appalling child abuse crimes. So to provide accurate information to help tackle serious crimes, we will make it a formal requirement for the first time to collect both ethnicity and nationality data for all cases of child sexual abuse and exploitation, and we will commission new research into the cultural and social drivers of child sexual exploitation, misogyny and violence against women and girls, as Baroness Casey has recommended.
Now that, to me, begins to look very suspicious. I mean, Shadow Education Secretary Neil O'Brien has already written on Substack before how the suspicion is compounded by the fact that sex offenders almost always have their sex, usually male, I think 75% male, according to Louise Casey's report, recorded at the time they were booked by the police, but not their ethnicity. So this seems to be a purposeful anti-racist policing strategy to manage community cohesion. And Louise Casey confirmed this when she said she was looking through case files and saw that the phrase Pakistani was Tipexed out, so it was erased by ink.
I think that there has been a tendency for people who've been worried about the story to have been labelled as racist.
Yes, I mean, I found it in Rotherham. It was one of those moments in life where I was following through on a children's file, an archive, child in, and found the word Pakistani Tipexed out. And I thought whoever did that inadvertently was giving ammunition to the English Defence League that were every week in and out campaigning and doing their stuff in that town. I think the problem is that people are worried about being called racist. In a way, they just give more ammunition to... If good people don't grasp difficult things, bad people will. And that's why we have to do it as a society.
So there are people here that are trying to cover up the fact that Pakistani men are responsible for these family and clan-based child sexual exploitation networks, usually linked to the taxi trade and county lines gangs. And I remember one euphemism that was used in her 2015 report by a witness was that they said... They had to say, when they were talking about Pakistani taxi drivers, they had to say, men of a certain ethnicity engaged in a given profession. That tells you absolutely nothing. That statement is contentless, and the entire thing is designed as a cover-up to, yes, for reasons of political correctness, but to lie to the British public to ensure they are forced to have a positive opinion of the Pakistani enclaves that are imported into their midst, who themselves have nothing but contempt for their white British host majority. But the data that Louise Casey does provide from local police authorities helps us paint a picture for that remaining missing 65% of data. So for 9 of the 51 local child safeguarding reviews listed by Casey in her report, they list Asian perpetrators as the majority, and we know this is not Japanese businessmen. It's usually Middle Eastern, North African, and particularly Pakistani, particularly Mirpur Pakistani males. 1 list white perpetrators, and the remaining 35 did not report ethnicity data. But of the areas where she did get ethnicity data, only 28% of perpetrators are white, and 66 did not have their ethnicity recorded. The suspect data in Manchester shows that Asians make up 20% of the population, but 54% of child sexual offence suspects. In Rotherham, ethnic Pakistanis made up 4% of the population, but 64% of child sexual abuse and exploitation perpetrators. So that per capita overrepresentation is even worse when you consider that composition of the local population being 4% is somewhat closer to 2, actually, because it's usually Pakistani men between the ages of like 15 and 60 who perpetrate these crimes. And they're usually, husbands, cousins, brothers, or often the same thing, sons, fathers, and they are defended by the women and children who know this is going on, but because it's happening to white kafar girls who are dressed immodestly by Islamic standards, they justify it and they shout out during the trials, "I love you, Dad," despite knowing what their relatives have done to these British children. And they often attack physically and blame through online campaigns and have even doxed the victims of these crimes, breaking the law themselves. We saw this in the recent Channel 4 documentary where a grooming gang perpetrator continued to profess his innocence on a TikTok live stream while he was in prison. And this was run by, I think it was his sister, and she was openly breaking the law by saying the identity of the victim, which is meant to be protected, and live streaming with her brother while he was in jail. What we have to understand is that our guilt-based universalist morality that values the innocence of children in and of itself does not apply to these people. They have a strong concept of asabaya, which some people argue is condemned in the Quran and Hadiths, but it's only condemned insofar as this asabaya, which is a sort of clannish loyalty to the family, members of the Ummah, so the sort of global Muslim race in their conception. Asabaya is only condemned insofar as your loyalty to your clan causes you to cover up its secrets, which then do it harm. However, if your loyalty to your clan is doing damage to an outgroup, that is acceptable. Whereas we in Christian, if not at least suppositionally Christian Britain, with Christianity baked into our common law tradition with Blackstone's formulation, we see the worth of an individual being of equal and inalienable moral dignity if they are innocent, and the guilt of an individual being irrespective of their membership to a family, a faith, a community, a clan, or an ummah. That does not apply. And this is why a lot of the grooming gang perpetrators will insist they are innocent, will claim that the prosecution and the police and that are racist, and then when you trip the hair trigger of what they really think about their victims and the civilization around them, they will, as one Rochdale ringleader did in 2017, go on racist rants saying Pakistanis are the supreme race and you will get a destroyer of Muslims, and then smiling when he is sentenced. Or in 2017, when Rotherham gangs were prosecuted, 2 of them shouted Allahu Akbar as they left court. And this is why there is such a conspiracy of silence around these communities, and this is why it is so difficult actually to unpick the individual culpability of the rapists themselves from the wider culpability of the community. One of the heads of the Ramadan Foundation in 2016 wrote for the Daily Mail after, I think it was the Hussein brothers, so 3 of his cousins were prosecuted. And he said that the British Pakistani community can no longer afford to have their heads in the sand on this issue, and we all know it's basically a dirty secret among our families, but that lots of Pakistanis don't want to speak up because, and this is a quote, they didn't want to be seen as siding with the white enemy. And it's no wonder that when Yvette Cooper got up and announced the national inquiry after the Casey report, she insisted that British Pakistanis are just as appalled as the white British host majority whose daughters have been raped and attacked. If that is the case, if, as Naz Shah insists, as the MP for Bradford West, that one of the largest Muslim constituencies in the country are just as outraged about the rape gang scandal.
That's Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for her leadership and commitment to get a grip on this issue. As a Member of Parliament for one of the largest constituencies, Muslim and Pakistani heritage people, Muslims, I know the sheer anger and condemnation that the vast majority of them share, like all Britons, against those that commit these vile actions and vile sexual abuse. This is not only backed by recent polling by Opinion that shows Muslims are deeply concerned, majority of them, about grooming gangs, but by sermons in mosques, letters from leading figures, demonstrations on the streets, and so much more, often not given the media coverage that they deserve. I am pleased to see the National Crime Agency will be involved in the future inquiries, and let me reiterate in this House that British Muslims stand on the side of victims and support the full force of the law against all perpetrators of abuse. But would the Home Secretary agree with me that those that display selective outrage or fan the flames to blame entire communities do nothing to protect innocent victims or further the cause of victims?
Bear in mind, in 2017, Naz Shah retweeted and liked an Owen Jones parody account that said that these abused girls in Rotherham should shut their mouths for the good of diversity. So you may question her record on this. If it were the case, though, that Pakistani enclaves and British Muslims are as concerned as the likes of me or Maggie Oliver or Charlie Peters or Sam Bidwell or all of you watching, where are the protests about it? They had no qualms about turning out for Gaza every weekend and Wednesday on the night of October 7th, before Israel had even retaliated. I don't think there's been one single widespread march to the same scale by British Pakistanis and Muslims anxious to collectively clear their name. Instead, when imams for Together Against Grooming tried reading out sermons in their mosques, they were shouted down by members of the mosque. Instead, as Dr. Taj Hargey, an imam of I think he's the Oxford Islamic Centre, who has been speaking out about this for over 10 years, by the way. He first wrote a piece in 2013 about the Oxford grooming gang, and then has recently done GB News interviews in January and this week. As he has said, instead they're getting instructions from the 3Ms, the mullahs, the mosque and the madrasas, so the imams or clerics, their places of worship and their religious schools, that white women are less than nothing, that they are ripe for use for extramarital sexual exploitation, that if you commit sex offences against a kafar, an unbeliever, then you will still get into heaven because you haven't committed offence against a Muslim within your clan or within your ummah.
The first aim are the mullahs. The mullahs are supposedly the priests, the clergy of the Muslim community. Most of them are underqualified, don't have the proper credentials, and don't have proper integration in this country. So they do not understand this culture and society of the United Kingdom. And they present a toxic theology, which is the second M. This toxic theology is in the mosque. So in the mosque, people are taught that it's perfectly fine to have underage sex with young girls because the Prophet Muhammad, according to them, which is not true, but according to them, the Prophet Muhammad married a girl of 9 years old. So when we have this type of pedophilia being spouted from the pulpits, of course it has a clear resonance with the Pakistani community. And then the third M is the madrasas. The madrasas are so-called religious schools. Now these religious schools that usually takes place after state schools, secular schools, in afternoons, they are giving them the same type of propaganda to the children about, yes, patriarchy is fine, misogyny is great, chauvinism is wonderful, and so these people, especially the boys, grow up thinking that women are second grade and shouldn't be valued. So unless this inquiry actually deals with the theology, the 3 M's, we are not going to go anywhere. Yes, absolutely, because the mullahs tells them that these are all a bunch of kafir, kuffar, plural, kafir, unbelievers, heathens, not worthy of anything. They are subhuman. And so they are white trash and white meat to be used by Pakistani men to have their kick, so to speak. And many of them are in loveless marriage, arranged marriages, and they think this type of extra marital sexual activity is just wonderful for the ego and for the sense of well-being.
Those members, those, let's say, moderate Muslims, who have a different interpretation of the Quran and disregard the hadiths, as Taj Hargay does, and I may disagree with him on theology on that point, but, you know, he seems like a nice chap, so I don't wish to disparage. Those Muslims are marginalized. They are not the source of authority that the British Pakistani community takes seriously. The British Pakistani community attends, I think it's upwards of 80% as of 2009 when data was last properly published on this. It was under the Blair government. The British Pakistani community attends Debunking school mosques, which is a sect of Islam established in the Indian subcontinent that was expressly against the British Empire. And these are shaped by the Muslim Council of Britain. Now, the Muslim Council of Britain in 2015 was accused of being a kind of idea laundry by the British government for the Muslim Brotherhood being the conspiratorial jihadist body that invented the term Islamophobia, according to Dr. Giles Keppel, and an ex-jihadist who corroborates his claim, to try to cloak criticisms of Islam in the same impervious armour that attacks on Jews have with the phrase anti-Semitism, or the gay rights lobby achieved when inventing the term homophobia. So they're trying to prevent Islam from having any criticism. The Muslim Council of Britain are accused of being an idea laundry for the Muslim Brotherhood, and they influence a hell of a lot of emphasis on British mosques. The current Secretary General gave a speech a couple of years ago, I think it was 2022, where he said that British Muslims need to raise generation of Saladin after Saladin after Saladin until we have too many to know what to do, which I think is just a blatant call for violence in this country, considering the dichotomy of the ruling Christian morality being the enemy of the Crusades for the Saracens, and Muslims in Britain being Saracens, therefore they need to go to war with their civilization. I would think that's a call for violence. And then also the Muslim Council of Britain engaging in acts of malfeasance to constantly accuse people who had raised the alarm about the grooming gangs racist and Islamophobic. The highest profile case, of course, is Suella Braverman in 2023, where she wrote a piece for The Mail, and the Muslim Council of Britain, via the Centre for Media Monitoring, their sort of ostensibly neutral PR arm that wages lawfare against people and writes slanderous reports about stations like GB News, they put forward a press regulatory body, IPSO, complaint against Suella Braverman, and even though it wasn't upheld, the Mail threw Suella Braverman under the bus because Suella Braverman said the majority of the men committing grooming gang offences are ethnically Pakistani, and they published a retraction, they corrected her article, and she had her reputation dragged through the mud by the press. Suella Braverman is now pursuing an apology from IPSO, not necessarily a retraction, an apology on behalf of the victims for whom they contributed to a climate of cover-up and censorship, and the justification for which they cited the 2020 Home Office report, which has now been comprehensively debunked and refuted by Louise Casey's report. She also provided more stats, by the way, on West Yorkshire. Now, this is very curious because, of course, West Yorkshire was the place that I reported a Freedom of Information request data on for Carriage Media. She found that in West Yorkshire, 35% of suspects are Asian compared to 34% white. So in absolute terms, for those for whom we have ethnicity data available, there are more Asian, so Pakistani and other Middle Eastern ethnicities, and obviously subcontinental, there are more Asian suspects than there are white, despite white British making up an absolute majority, for the time being, of the population. So Asians are overrepresented by 2 to 4 times their share of the local population, and Pakistanis by 21 times their share of the national population in West Yorkshire. Now, this obviously corroborates with the data that I published on Courage Media that found that Pakistanis were 21.48% of all suspects. Asian suspects a possible 42.73%, given there was a lot of ethnicity unknown, so that leaves quite a lot of room for the potential for them to be all of those suspects for whom ethnicity was not recorded, and that a fifth of all suspects had no ethnicity data recorded. And white children were the overwhelming majority of victims. So that means that it was not within families, as a lot of sexual abuse is committed, tragically. Instead, it is extra ethnic, extra community, extra religious. So this is a targeting by one community, one ethnicity, one religion on another. And again, we do say religion. As Taj Hargay has been talking about, this anti-white, anti-Christian, anti-British ideology is disseminated out via mosques and madrasas from imams. And Maggie Oliver made sure to emphasize this in a Sky News interview after the Casey report was published. This was on Tuesday, when Casey was delivering testimony to the Home Affairs Select Committee. Maggie Oliver went on Sky News and on the Daily Tea, the Telegraph podcast, and insisted, yes, it is Pakistani males, but also Islam has an under-discussed role to play here because there are Afghanis, there are Eritreans, and so they are able to be enlisted in these close-knit family, community, and clan networks of sexual exploitation, and the only thing binding them together is Islam.
I have seen nationalities that are not Pakistani men in these gangs, but many of them are Afghanistani or Iranian or Iraqi, but they are still all Muslim. And it is an issue when we see increasing numbers of illegal immigration into the country, where many of those immigrants share the same belief systems and different ways of treating women. I am really, really grateful to Baroness Casey for gripping that nettle, because if we don't, as a country, we are just abandoning more generations of children to the horrific, life-destroying crime that I have seen again and again.
The reason Islam binds them together, and again, Dr. Hargay may take objection to this, is because there are verses, not just in the Hadith, but in the Quran, and there are instances in Islamic history that justify taking sex slaves. I mean, this is that which the right hand belongs to you, as ordained by Allah, as the spoils of war, as booty, as the Prophet Muhammad is meant to have said. And Hargay even himself says, and he says it's a false interpretation of the doctrine, but it is in the Hadiths in multiple places, that the Prophet Muhammad married Aisha, age 6, and consummated the marriage, age 9. And so if Muhammad is the perfect man whose life is to be emulated, then this would legitimize relations with children, especially children of the ethnic outgroup, to whom you do not have to extend the same moral consideration that universalist moralists who believe in Christianity or the modern liberal doctrine of human rights in Britain would extend to the children of Muslims. This is why there are so many white leftists, for example, who hate Christianity, who are principally concerned about the children in Gaza, thousands of miles away. Whereas, again, how many British Muslims have shown such concern for the abused white working class English girls in this country, and some Sikhs, of course, that they have turned out on the streets to march alongside them for ages. The Sikhs have turned out to march along with the English. The Sikhs have actually, in their Gurdwaras, given lectures to the Sikh community to protect themselves against Islam, and they would know an awful lot about the violence committed by Muslims against them in India. Of course, that's kind of what their religion's based on. So they have a collective understanding of this, and they have raised the alarm. Why haven't the Muslim community? And this is the main issue with Louise Casey's report. Now, I've got a lot of admiration for the work that Louise Casey has done. The fact that she's just again had the entire section titled Denial, that she's documented cases where the NHS would take in girls, aged 14, and day after day they would be asking for the morning after pill, but raise no alarm about this. This is something, by the way, that Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp has said. We should be applying the misconduct in public office standard too, that we should be going after these people and they should rot in prison if you can prove they've done something wrong. This is why Maggie Oliver has brought forward a judicial review that happened to have just been brought forward on the day that Casey's report came out, hoping to hold a lot of these public officials to account that, killed Operation Augusta or buried evidence. I believe that Louise Casey actually had to put out a notice to the government saying that they should make sure that police officers, local government, social workers don't start burning documents like this is the last days of the Third Reich and trying to bury their culpability in all this. However, Casey does phrase things in a way which are still too concerned with the second-order effects of Muslim and Pakistani enclaves in Britain suffering some sort of reputation damage or repercussion from just laying the facts out there. She is still far too concerned with what public perception of Pakistani communities who have committed these crimes and covered them up for decades will be, while trying to myth bust the fact that, you know, as Tessa Munt said, white men are still responsible for this. She writes, for example, the system claims there is an overwhelming problem with white perpetrators when that can't be proved. This does no one any favours at all, and least of all those in the Asian, Pakistani or Muslim communities who needlessly suffer as those with malicious intent use this obfuscation to sow and spread hatred. During her Home Affairs Select Committee testimony, she was labouring the point that members of the far right or bad faith actors will seize upon these stats and discuss them if left to their own devices, if they were only left in a vacuum, and sensible, cool-headed members of the political establishment didn't deal with this issue first. She did the same thing on an interview with the newsagents, who I noticed Lewis Goodall was present rather than Emily Maitlis and John Sopel interviewing her, given Emily Maitlis had only weeks before accused Rupert Lowe of being a racist for focusing on the Pakistani ethnic composition of the grooming gangs, and she then misquoted Operation Hydrant statistics, which actually, if you look at them, show a disproportionate overrepresentation of Asian Pakistani offenders among those perpetrating group-based child sexual exploitation, as has been the case for years with the Quilliam Foundation report, with the 2013 National Crime Agency report that found, I think it was 75% of offenders were Asian in type 1 group-based child sexual exploitation. Louise Casey is putting too much emphasis on this being, as she said, a gift to the racists.
You've got to be utterly responsible with data anyway, but specifically when it's around protected characteristics. In recent times, people, the police, MPCC and others, every visit I went to, people would say the vast majority of people that commit child sexual exploitation in group-based are white. I would say, upon what basis have you made that? You know, slide 1, slide 2, and I was like, And then you realise they're making that finding on the basis of 34% of completion of the data. You can't make that. So people are leaning into a finding that they wanted, which is what I saw in Rotherham, and at one level Tipexing out Pakistani on a children's service file, which was probably done in a well-meaning way because they'll be worried about sort of racism that flows from that, is actually a gift to racists. I mean, all of this is a gift to the racists. If good people don't look at difficult issues, bad people will, and even worse people will then exploit them. So, that's my general view of difficult things that I've been asked to look at in life, and this is now the other. So
I don't care to which political faction the facts that have been covered up for so long are a gift to. I care about truth and transparency and ensuring that not one single foreign paedophile ever comes to this country again, that all of those here are detained and deported, that the families who covered up for their crimes also suffer consequences, that the public officials who handed over these girls as sacrificial lambs to maintaining community cohesions or to protect their own reputations from being impugned by accusations of racism. I think they need to face charges of misconduct in public office and serve prison time. I want all of the girls that were victimised and abused to have their criminal records expunged, as Yvette Cooper has promised, but even Louise Casey said this is going to be difficult to disentangle from multiple charges. I want them compensated, and I want every single potential victim to be protected. I never want another one of these crimes to happen again, and I don't care who does it and how. I do not care about the hidden prejudices in the heart of people who have been right on this issue for decades. Perfect example here, right? I do not like the British National Party. I think they're odious. They are unapologetic neo-Nazis. Bad idea, right? We do not need to indulge in 1930s pagan German race socialism in order to save our country, especially because that ideology didn't even work for them. We can be British patriots without needing to indulge in that. However, Charlene Downs' mother, Karen, went to BNP leader Nick Griffin for help because she could not find her missing daughter. Now, her daughter is still believed to have been murdered and minced into kebab meat because the two suspects who were charged with doing so, the jury couldn't reach a decision, and then they were let off on a technicality because the police had improperly gathered evidence or something. She went to Nick Griffin of the BNP for help. Hope Not Hate then wrote a smear piece on her. Now you have Nick Lowles coming out, who, by the way, in 2023, dogpiled on Suella Braverman and said that she was spreading racist rhetoric, whipping up racial hatred, and playing into the hands of the far right. You have Nick Lowles coming out and saying that he's so glad the government are doing the right thing on this. Nick, where was Hope Not Hate's vast resources when someone like Karen Downs needed you most? If it really were the case, as Louise Casey has put forward, that sensible political voices could have got a handle on this years ago, where were they? Why were they so busy dismissing, until literally 2 days ago, why were they so busy dismissing everyone as a far-right Islamophobic racist for being right about this issue? Tommy Robinson being the prime example. Now, again, Robinson would admit to being an imprudent actor. I don't want to go through his unrelated criminal charges to this issue. I don't want to relitigate his personal failings, for example, his battles with drink and drug addiction. He's spoken about that all himself. He has been right on this issue, unwaveringly correct on this issue. And it seems his crime on this issue was being correct before the establishment were comfortable with talking about it. And his activism, as has been the movement of the Overton window by Rupert Lowe and Katie Lamb and Robert Jenrick and Chris Philp and Charlie Peters and Guy Dampier, Sam Bidwell, Sam Ashworth-Haynes, Max Tempers, all these people that have done, Anne Cryer, the late Andrew Norfolk, all these people that have done, Maggie Oliver, all these people that have done fantastic work on this. All of these were the necessary preconditions to bring us here. And they were the sorts of people who put the work in while sustaining the arrows of slander of being called racist. So if Louise Casey is still principally concerned about the racists, which is an ill-defined category anyway, taking hold of this data, rather than just laying all the data out there, I have concerns that the inquiry will not sufficiently explore, as Maggie Oliver and Taj Hargey and Raja Mia and all of these people have said, that the inquiry will not sufficiently explore the racial and religious motivations that the perpetrators themselves are honest about. You know, Dr. Ella Hill wrote for The Independent that she was subjected to forced Quran verse readings and that her abusers would justify their abuse of her by referencing the similar verses in the Quran that Taj Hargey said that they could cite as the justification for their crimes. And so, if Louise Casey is still concerned about protecting the Pakistani community from reputation damage for the crimes that many of them have committed, I mean, Sam Ashworth-Haynes posted an excerpt from an article that he put in the Telegraph on X the other day that said 1 in 16 Pakistani men have been arrested for child sex offences in Rotherham. That's a staggering number. If that is the scale of this abuse and the cover-up, then yes, there is going to be some sort of collective judgment by the white working class, British majority, of the Pakistani enclaves that they never wanted imported into their country anyway, and you can't do anything about that except if you engage in the same kind of censorship or looking the other way on the motivations that are caught up with these crimes as the kinds of people that were Tipp-Xing out the word Pakistani in the case files that you found, Louise. And you can already see this narrative on the march, because during the Home Affairs Select Committee meeting that Louise Casey participated in, Bell Ribeiro-Addy decided to turn around and obfuscate, again, the ethnic composition and the religious makeup of the gangs, blame networks of patriarchal men, very nebulous term, from all races and all communities, and then, in a really disturbing sort of partisan smear, say that her fellow MPs are part of these patriarchal networks of men, and she didn't mean the independent Muslim MPs, of course, and that, therefore, they are comparable to the mindset of the leaders of the grooming gangs.
And note that the issue of race, and I welcome the fact that you've challenged it quite robustly, has really been quite loud, and even within the report and the Home Secretary's statement, we've touched on the issue of asylum seekers and immigration and race, and can be synonymous. But a lot of the time these issues are about closed patriarchal groups of men, which, we've pointed out exist in all races and all ethnicities. They even exist in this house. They're the scourge of the earth, if you want to call them that. How do we make sure that we focus on targeting them? Because sometimes when that noise comes about, and it has come about in this reporting, it shifts the focus away from the victims, and that's been the saddest thing. We focused on groups of perpetrators and not the victims.
That's a really important point and good question, is that I almost feel that because we haven't done the job right around collecting ethnicity properly, it means that, in a way, the bigger issue, dare I say it, which is men's violence towards women, is in danger of being lost. And so I think that, I think in a way that's why it feels that is something that all of us in society, there are so many good men that, need to step into the space of helping to do something about that, not just around child abuse, but more generally. And if we're still arguing over data around ethnicity, we won't get to the bigger issue, which is no matter what ethnicity, religion, age, or whatever, why do men commit these offences against girls? And you can do all of some women, some are men, boy victims. Child sex abuse that we're talking about today is largely men, if not nearly all men, against girls, and some of them are young. So I think I'm with you on that. I just think that in a way, until we get this stuff sorted from a policy level, the point you're making will continue to be missed.
Now, this is disgusting from this gelatinous race grifter who, no shock, worked as a staffer for Diane Abbott. However, point being, Louise Casey then followed up by engaging with the point rather than saying that Ribeiro-Addy is herself perpetuating the same chilling effect concerning the ethnicity and religion of the perpetrators that stifled conversations about the grooming gangs for decades and kept survivors quiet. It's no wonder that Marlon West, the father of Scarlett, a victim of the Greater Manchester grooming gangs, said at a press conference with Kemi Badenoch that same morning, at the same time that Casey was giving her testimony, that he just doesn't trust Labour. He said that he's met with Jess Phillips before, the Home Office Minister, who couldn't be bothered to respond to Oldham Council's request for national support with their local inquiries, tried to bury the 5 local inquiries, and caused such a headache for the government that they had to reverse course, tried to make the entire scandal about herself because she thought Elon Musk said some mean things to her on X. And then on Monday, during Yvette Cooper's announcement of the national support for local inquiries, which is what this national inquiry actually is, which is another concern, she was checking her phone laughing and then realising she was on camera and putting her serious face on. The woman has no conscience. Well, Marlon West said, well, he met with Jess Phillips multiple times and it felt like he had the door slammed in his face. So he's got absolutely no faith in the Labour Party or the government at all. And these people don't want to be partisan politicians. Their names have only been made because they have broken anonymity, spoken to the press in the Channel 4 Grooming Gang documentary that came out recently, and have forced themselves to become political actors because this has fallen along political party lines. And West himself has said to Tim Stanley of The Telegraph, he thinks that Labour are trading these girls for votes. Especially, for example, Jess Phillips, who has a slim vote majority of 693 in Birmingham Yardley and nearly lost her seat to multiple independent and Workers' Party of Britain Muslim candidates. So she feels that she cannot upset the apple cart and cast necessary aspersions on the Pakistani Muslim community, who she thinks will be voting for her so that she can keep her comfortable job as Home Office Minister from here until the heat death of the universe. Jess Phillips is part of this network that actually, as is Belle Ribeiro-Addy, that Louise Casey drew attention to when she said, again, that the system claims there is an overwhelming problem with white perpetrators that can't be proved. Members of that system include the Labour frontbench. They include Lucy Powell, who deflected a question from Tim Montgomery on the BBC about the grooming gangs and said, oh, you want to get that little trumpet out, do we? Let's blow that dog whistle, implying that any conversation about them was racist.
I don't know whether you saw the documentary on Channel 4 about rape gangs over this.
We want to blow that little trumpet now, do we? Yeah, okay.
There was a real issue.
Let's get that dog whistle out, shall we? Yeah.
Okay, Lucy. Yeah. The councils, there were so many people who were so afraid for good... Can I just finish the point, just for one minute?
Finish that point, Tim, and then I'll bring in Helen.
Look, there were so many people in local government, in the authorities, who, for good reasons, were worried about upsetting community tensions, that those girls went undefended. Now, there were good reasons for it, but no one has still been brought to justice for that. So you tell me, Lucy, that this isn't a culture in local government. It's just not true.
It includes the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who said that those who wanted a national inquiry are jumping aboard a far-right bandwagon.
And when politicians, and I mean politicians, who sat in government for many years, are casual about honesty, decency, truth, and the rule of law, calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics, because a robust debate can only be based on the true facts.
And, obviously, Downing Street, who then came out and defended his statement by saying that, no, he was referring to the Conservative politicians who did absolutely nothing for years and are now getting on board with it because Elon Musk tweeted about it. I mean, number one, I agree with the criticism that Kemi Badenoch didn't say anything about this for 14 years, including when she was Women and Equalities Minister. It's not in her Hansard record at all, and she's admitted this. But number two, he is still insisting in there, because it hasn't been retracted, that those of us who are concerned about this are far right. So, I know the word far right means nothing, but to them, it means beneath contempt. So they think everyone who's concerned about this is beneath contempt, even though they are still positioning themselves as morally correct on this issue now that they are doing a national inquiry. It includes David Lammy as well, mastermind of Britain, the Foreign Secretary, who in 2020 disparaged then sitting Home Secretary and himself second-generation Pakistani Sajid Javid, because Sajid Javid celebrated the prosecution of a group of grooming gang perpetrators, and he said they were Asian men. And David Lammy said that he was furthering the cause of far-right rhetoric by targeting one community, of which he probably considers himself a member. And a lot of this is done, as Belle Ribeiro-Addy's was, her point was, out of a sense of ethnic solidarity with the perpetrators. So, let's put it this way. If the Labour government will lose votes by exploring the role of Islam as a motivating factor for the perpetrators, if many of their MPs belonging to a class of minority or global majority or BAME or immigrant heritage see themselves to have ethnic solidarity with the offenders, as well as the Muslim MPs who feel they have religious solidarity with the offenders, and the independent MPs, like Ayub Khan, who got up at a meeting in Birmingham that was lobbying for a Mirpur Pakistani airport, that said that the idea that the Pakistanis are responsible for the grooming gangs is a far-right narrative done to sow division.
So when the right-wing media and those that seek to undermine, they are using a false narrative. And there's nothing new in that, because we know what they have ran in the past, whether it's in relation to the people that stand up for human rights, for Palestine in Kashmir, whether it's to do with grooming gangs. It's a narrative that is done in order to sow division.
And if all of these inquiries, by the way, are local-led inquiries with national backing and statutory powers with a time limit of 3 years, to what extent is this inquiry going to be sufficient, transparent, and result in the kind of truth and reconciliation reckoning required for us as a country to ensure that this great crime never happens again? I am very suspicious. And this is why I'm very glad that Rupert Lowe's private inquiry is still going ahead. It will still make all of the data gathered publicly available. It will still be broadcast and shared all over X. And this will hold the government's feet to the fire as the standard for which a sufficient grooming gang inquiry must be conducted. And so I'd just like to end this by commending everyone who did a lot of work to ensure we got to this point. Again, Sam Bidwell, Sam Ashworth-Haynes, Charlie Peters, Guy Dampier, Max Tempers, everyone who was courageous enough to share this information, to talk about it for years when it was unpopular. But we aren't done, and the Labour government still need a hell of a lot of scrutiny if victims are ever to see justice.